The shame enveloped the space. "Do you still not understand your place, Janet?" Gerald Hayes, the operations manager, sneered with a voice full of disdain. "You're nothing but a janitor, nothing at all. Clean this floor again until I can see my reflection clearly in it, or never come back here again." "Sir, I've cleaned it many times already," Mary Williams replied calmly, her voice still steady despite the cruel insult. Without saying another word, Gerald grabbed a cup full of cold water and deliberately poured it straight onto Mary's head. The cold water poured down her hair, streaming over her face, soaking her uniform, and collecting at her feet on the newly cleaned, shiny floor. The sudden cold made her flinch, but what truly stunned her was the deliberate cruelty of the act. "Now you have something real to clean," Gerald mocked, turning away with a sense of triumph. But he couldn't have known that the woman he had just humiliated wasn't just a frail janitor, but the very woman who had built this company from scratch. A woman with enough power, determination, and resolve to bring his entire career crashing down in an instant. At the top floor of a skyscraper in the heart of bustling New York City, Williams Innovations stood tall and authoritative, with its iconic logo shining brightly every night. Behind this resounding success was the extraordinary story of the woman named Mary Williams, whom everyone in the industry referred to with two words full of respect: the legend. Mary Williams was not born into wealth. At the age of 25, when society still held strong biases against black women, Mary dared to dream of creating her own financial tech empire. Starting with a small rented office in the suburbs and little capital scraped together from friends, she worked tirelessly, slowly turning her dream into reality. 35 years later, from the days when she had to sleep on her desk because she couldn't afford an apartment, to building a powerful fintech corporation worth billions of dollars with thousands of employees worldwide, Mary never forgot her humble beginnings. But time does not spare anyone, and Mary was no exception. After more than 3 decades of dedication, she realized it was time to hand over the reins to the most trusted successor, her only son, Robert Williams. Robert, well trained by Mary, had graduated from Harvard with numerous outstanding achievements and had been carefully mentored by his mother to understand the core values of the company: equality, creativity, and respect for everyone. However, what Mary did not foresee was that after stepping down from the leadership position, the company that had once symbolized innovation and social equality began to show dangerous cracks. Unsettling news started to filter to her through former loyal colleagues. Whispers about the arrogance of senior managers, the mistreatment of lower-level employees, subtle discrimination, and a tense atmosphere of pressure led her to question: could her son, Robert, still uphold the values she had taught him? As each day passed, Mary's unease grew. Unable to sit idly by while the company she had built with so much effort was being destroyed by distorted values, Mary Williams made a bold decision, one no one expected. She would disguise herself as an ordinary janitor and work in the very company she had founded, so she could witness the truth for herself. Mary knew that this act could put her in difficult and complex situations, but to her, nothing was more precious than the truth and justice. Dressed in a janitor's uniform, using the fake name Janet, the woman who had once stood at the pinnacle of success was about to embark on a journey she could not even predict, confronting the truth and seeking to restore the soul of her own creation, Williams Innovations. The decision was made, and Mary Williams quietly began her plan, not revealing it to anyone. Not even her son, Robert. On her first day back at Williams Innovations, under the guise of an elderly janitor named Janet, Mary's heart fluttered with a mix of nervousness and uncertainty, feelings she hadn't experienced in decades. That evening, the office lights dimmed as employees began to leave. Mary entered through the staff-only entrance for custodians. The place was completely different from the image she had once remembered of a company that was the pride of her life. There were no more respectful glances, no more cheerful greetings from the managers. In her simple gray uniform, Mary immediately felt her invisibility in the eyes of the young people rushing home. Her first shift began at 10 p.m. She was given a quick introduction by a middle-aged man, the janitorial team manager, whose cold demeanor was apparent. He handed her a cleaning cart with a few supplies and quickly walked away, offering no further instructions. Mary stood in the long, empty hallway, looking at the name tag on her chest that read, Janet, feeling both alienated and saddened. Lost in thought, she noticed a figure approaching from the end of the hallway. The footsteps echoed with authority and arrogance. It was Gerald Hayes, the new operations manager, whom Mary had only heard of through Robert. Gerald was about 45 years old, tall, with slicked-back light brown hair and an impeccably dressed tie. With just one glance, Mary could sense the suffocating self-satisfaction and authority emanating from him. Gerald stopped right in front of her, scanning her from head to toe before speaking in a condescending tone. "New here, are you? We don't pay for slow, old people. Work faster. I don't want to see a speck of dust around here." Mary tried to keep her voice steady and replied politely, "Yes, sir, I'll be careful." Gerald gave her a mocking smile and turned away, intentionally stepping on the area she had just cleaned, leaving muddy footprints behind. Mary's heart tightened at this open contempt. For a moment she questioned whether this was the right decision, but she quickly regained her composure. She silently cleaned the floor again, determined not to let this petty act sway her from her goal. Before her first shift ended, Mary had to face Derek Phillips, the young and stylish marketing director known for his sharp words and trendy attire. Derek had just finished a late meeting and, seeing Mary cleaning the common area, frowned in clear displeasure. "Clean faster. I don't want to see you lingering by my office door. Do you know how important our work is?" Without waiting for her response, Derek walked into his office and slammed the door shut. The abrupt sound of the door closing was the clearest sign to Mary that the culture of respect she had once built and was proud of had gradually eroded. Instead, there was an attitude of discrimination, arrogance, and disdain for the manual workers, those who were invisible in the eyes of those with power. Mary stood still in the silent hallway, her hand, once used to sign multi-million-dollar contracts, now trembling slightly on the rough handle of the mop. But then, she took a deep breath, reminding herself that this was just the beginning. Determined to uncover the truth about what was happening within her own company, Mary silently continued her work. She knew the road ahead would be long and full of challenges, and she might face things far worse than this. But for the future of Williams Innovations, for the honor and the values she had fought to protect her entire life, Mary understood that this was the moment she needed to be stronger than ever. The days that followed passed slowly, but for Mary, each minute was filled with heavy, bitter emotions. After the moment when Gerald and Derek left, she was no longer merely an observer. She had truly immersed herself in the invisible pains of the janitorial staff. What she saw was not just simple disrespect, but a whole culture of bitterness. A culture that dehumanized individuals. A culture that made her heart ache as she realized it was eroding the very values she had once nurtured. The more she played the role of Janet, the more Mary understood why the janitorial staff always kept their heads down, working hurriedly as though trying to avoid the gaze of the management. They had no voice, no right to defend themselves. They existed within the grand corridors, yet were never truly seen by the arrogant, indifferent managers. On Thursday evening, while cleaning the elevator area on the 42nd floor, Mary witnessed Gerald Hayes publicly humiliate a young janitor named Maria. Maria was in her early 30s, a Latin immigrant with a gentle face and a soft voice, always trying to avoid unnecessary conflict. At that moment, Maria accidentally dropped a small bottle of glass cleaner onto the floor, causing the liquid to splatter onto Gerald's shiny shoes. Gerald immediately exploded in anger, his voice echoing sharply in the empty corridor. "Do you know how much these shoes cost? Do you think you'll ever be able to pay for them with a lifetime of cleaning?" Maria, terrified, repeatedly bowed her head and apologized, but Gerald was not so easily appeased. He walked up to her, his tone threatening. "People like you need to know your place. If this happens again, don't even think about coming back here." He then walked off, leaving Maria standing motionless in the corridor, tears welling up on her pale, fear-stricken face. Mary rushed over, gently comforting Maria, her heart aching as she watched the young woman tremble, wiping away her tears and continuing her work as if nothing had happened. Witnessing this, Mary realized that the decline of the company's culture was far worse than she had imagined. It wasn't just Gerald. Mary also quickly realized that Derek Phillips was another dangerous figure. Derek was smart, sharp, but his talent was accompanied by arrogance and a lack of empathy. He often intentionally scattered paperwork and drinks on his desk, and every time he saw Mary cleaning, he would make her do it again and again until he was satisfied, but in reality, he was never satisfied. Derek wanted to assert his position, and Mary understood that he was doing this solely to affirm his absolute power over those he considered beneath him. Once, when Mary was collecting trash in Derek's office, he sat there, coldly staring at her and saying something that made Mary feel as though her heart had been cut with a knife. "Why do we still hire useless old people like you? A robot vacuum could do a better job." Mary bowed her head, not replying, and the pain of those words deepened as she realized that Derek didn't feel any remorse for his cruel, venomous comment. With each passing night, every time she faced indifference, Mary's heart grew heavier. She was not only heartbroken by Gerald's disrespect, Derek's cold contempt, but she was also tormented by the helpless silence of her fellow janitors, who couldn't defend themselves against this injustice. The toxic culture Mary was witnessing wasn't just a moral decline. It represented the rot that had taken root at the very foundation of the company she had once proudly built. But Mary was not discouraged. On the contrary, she became even more determined to uncover the truth behind the indifference and abuse of power. Because she knew, only by facing the deepest truth could she restore the lost soul of Williams Innovations, the company she had nurtured and cherished her entire life. The following days, the atmosphere at Williams Innovations seemed to grow more stifling than ever. For Mary, each day stepping into the workplace was no longer a source of pride, as it once had been, but a harsh challenge facing the bitter reality of what the company she had once loved and nurtured had become. Since she started disguising herself as Janet, Mary knew she would have to face difficulties, but she never expected them to be so merciless and direct, especially from Gerald Hayes, the operations manager, who was becoming increasingly aggressive and oppressive. From their first encounter, Gerald left a lasting impression on Mary with his cruelty hidden behind a polite exterior. However, the initial actions were just the beginning of the tense days to come. Gerald was like someone obsessed with perfection, but the perfection he demanded was not based on objective standards, but purely on the power he held in his hands. To Gerald, lower-level employees, especially janitors, were nothing more than small pieces on his personal power chessboard. One Wednesday evening, as Mary was finishing up cleaning the hallway on the 38th floor, Gerald suddenly appeared from behind. The hallway lights reflected off his face, casting a chilling, menacing look, and when he spoke his voice was so cold it made Mary shiver slightly. "Are you done, Janet?" Mary calmly replied, "Yes, Mr. Hayes. Everything has been cleaned according to procedure." Gerald glanced around, his eyes seeming to scrutinize every corner of the hallway Mary had just carefully cleaned. Unexpectedly, he stepped forward, pulled a small white cloth from his jacket pocket, and bent down to wipe a corner of the wall. Mary silently watched, waiting for the outcome of this surprise inspection. Gerald raised his head, holding the cloth high, and looked at Mary with a challenging gaze. "Is this what you call clean? Janet, I thought by your age you should know what clean looks like." Mary looked at the white cloth. It had no trace of dirt at all, but Gerald still acted as if it were the clearest proof of her laziness and irresponsibility. Gerald deliberately dropped the cloth onto the floor, then spoke again with a mocking tone. "Clean this entire hallway again. And remember, if you want to keep your job, I don't want to see a single mistake, no matter how small." Mary silently lowered her head, patiently picking up the cloth and continuing her work. Gerald walked away with a small, satisfied laugh, leaving her alone in the silent hallway, the weight of the moment pressing on her. But that wasn't the last time Gerald deliberately made things difficult for Mary. Just a few days later, when Mary was carefully cleaning the windows in the large conference room on the 40th floor, Gerald appeared again. This time, he brought a freshly brewed cup of hot coffee. Without saying a word, Gerald stepped over, stood next to Mary, looked out the window, and casually said, "Janet, do you know why people like you will always just be janitors?" Mary stopped her work, turned to face him, her gaze calm but with a storm brewing inside. "No, sir." Gerald took a sip of his coffee, his voice light but venomous. "Because people like you always accept mediocrity. You have no ambition, no capability, and no self-respect. You only do what's necessary, never excellent." With those words, Gerald tilted the coffee cup slightly, letting dark drops of coffee fall onto the freshly cleaned floor that Mary had just scrubbed. Each drop felt like a bitter sting straight to Mary's heart, but she silently watched, not saying a word in protest. Gerald placed the cup on the table and gestured, "Clean it up, Janet. I want this place to be so clean I can see my reflection in it." Mary patiently redid everything, even though she knew Gerald was intentionally tormenting her. In that moment, she understood more deeply than ever before the cruelty that janitorial staff had to endure every day. To Gerald, this abuse of power seemed like a sick pleasure, a way for him to demonstrate his superiority and absolute control. Not stopping at those simple actions, Gerald became increasingly aggressive, frequently making unreasonable and unfounded demands for Mary to redo tasks she had already completed excellently. She realized that Gerald was using her as an example to intimidate the entire janitorial staff. Gradually, Mary noticed the sympathetic glances of her coworkers, but no one dared to speak out in her defense. The atmosphere of fear and oppression that Gerald created grew more apparent. He wanted everyone to see him as someone to be feared, someone who couldn't be opposed. To achieve this, he had no qualms about trampling on the dignity and self-respect of the lowest-ranking employees in the company, those who had no ability to defend themselves. But what Gerald didn't know was that his actions were igniting a steely resolve in Mary, a determination stronger than ever before. For Mary, every time she endured Gerald's insults, she silently promised herself that she would never let people like him continue to destroy the company she had built. Sooner or later, she would find a way to put an end to these inhumane and cruel actions. With that resolve, Mary quietly continued her work, waiting for the right moment to expose the dark truth about Gerald Hayes. the man who thought he was in control of everything but was actually walking straight into the very power trap he had set for himself. The days working under Gerald's harsh supervision had gradually become a challenge that Mary thought she might never endure. But she constantly reminded herself of the bigger goal: to protect the soul and values of the company she had once dedicated her entire life to. Up until this point, despite Gerald's constant pressure, Mary had maintained her calm, trying not to let her emotions shake her plan. However, with each passing day, Gerald grew increasingly aggressive and showed his absolute power. Dissatisfied with merely having her repeat meaningless tasks, he began to publicly demean and humiliate her in front of other employees. It seemed that this only satisfied him more, seeing her remain silent and endure. One weekend evening, after finishing the cleaning in the main office area, Mary was doing a final check when Gerald suddenly entered, followed by a few younger management staff, each of them watching with a mixture of curiosity and concern. Mary sensed something was wrong when she saw the cold look in Gerald's eyes fixed on her. He walked closer, holding a cup of ice-cold water. Gerald's gaze now was not just the usual coldness she had grown accustomed to. It had turned into something more defiant and hostile, as if he had been waiting a long time for this moment. "Janet," Gerald spoke, his voice soft yet full of sarcasm, "I hear you still don't understand the cleaning standards of this company." Mary gently lifted her head, trying to keep her voice as calm as possible. "I believe I followed the correct procedure, Mr. Hayes." Gerald smirked with disdain. "Oh, the correct procedure. Then why is it that every time I inspect, I always find such trivial yet disappointing shortcomings?" The younger employees behind them started to whisper among themselves, their looks a mixture of awkwardness and curiosity directed at Gerald and Mary. The atmosphere in the room grew tense and suffocating, as if everyone was waiting for something unpleasant to happen. Mary calmly responded, "I'll pay more attention, sir." Gerald chuckled lightly, but his laughter felt like a dangerous warning. Suddenly, he moved closer to Mary, his gaze lowering in contempt. "The problem isn't attention, Janet. The problem is ability. People like you should learn to accept that you can't do anything well." Before she could respond, Gerald suddenly splashed the icy cold water straight onto Mary's head. The cold water poured down her hair, over her face, and onto her collar, soaking into her uniform. The room went completely silent. Mary stood motionless, the cold water dripping down her face. But what truly hurt her more than anything was the ultimate humiliation she was suffering right in the company she had once built with her own hands. The young employees witnessing this were shocked by Gerald's actions, but none dared to speak out or intervene. They were afraid, and it was this fear that Gerald wanted. He looked around, satisfied with the tense atmosphere he had created, then turned to Mary, his voice filled with malice. "Now you have something to clean, Janet. Remember where you are, and who holds the power here." Gerald turned and walked away, and the other employees immediately lowered their heads, avoiding eye contact with her before quickly exiting the room, leaving Mary alone with the overwhelming sense of bitterness and shame rising in her heart. When the door closed behind the last person, Mary slowly took a tissue to wipe her face, her hand trembling not from the cold, but from the rage that had been suppressed to the point of suffocation. It had been a long time since Mary had felt so humiliated and hurt. In that brief moment, she wondered if this suffering was worth it, if she had the strength to continue on this difficult path ahead. But then, in the midst of her weakest moment, Mary suddenly remembered why she had started this journey. She thought about each small janitor silently enduring similar things every day, but unable to speak out. She thought about Maria with her eyes welling up in fear when Gerald insulted her, about the bowed heads, the tired sighs when they were made to do meaningless tasks over and over again. She knew that her endurance today wasn't just to expose Gerald. It was to reveal a much darker truth. The deep rot within the culture of a company that had once been a symbol of respect and equality. Mary wiped the water from her face, took a deep breath, and her eyes shone with determination and strength like never before. Gerald had no idea that the action he thought was an act of power and humiliation was actually the last straw, the final push that would make her even stronger in her fight against the injustice and abuse of power at Williams Innovations. In the silence, Mary made a promise to herself. She would never let today's humiliation and bitterness be in vain. Gerald might think he had won when he saw her soaked and humiliated, but he had no idea that his actions had sparked a fierce fire of determination inside her. From this moment on, Mary understood more clearly than ever before. She was not only fighting to regain her own value and dignity, but also to protect the voiceless, to stand up for those who silently endure every day, and to reclaim the true soul of Williams Innovations, her beloved creation, which she cherished more than anything else in the world. After the painful incident with Gerald, every step Mary took down the hallway of Williams Innovations felt heavier. Yet she remained steadfast in her plan, promising herself that the bitterness she endured would not be in vain. Mary knew that, aside from Gerald, there were many others in the leadership team who were silently abusing their power just as ruthlessly, and among them, the most prominent was Derek Phillips, the young, ambitious, and cold marketing director. Derek Phillips was the type of young manager often featured in business magazines, with a polished smile and perfectly crafted success stories. But behind this glamorous facade, Mary began to see a completely different person. Derek wasn't just arrogant and cold. He also held disdain for anyone he deemed inferior to him. To Derek, the existence of janitorial staff like Mary was simply to serve and endure every insult without the right to respond. From the very first days that Mary entered the company under the name Janet, Derek had shown clear discomfort at seeing her work near his office. But as time passed, Derek's attitude grew increasingly extreme and aggressive. While Gerald openly tormented Mary with direct actions, Derek employed a more subtle method. He created difficult situations, intentionally made messes, and forced Mary to repeat her work over and over, aiming to wear her down and make her feel helpless. One evening, at the start of the week, after Mary had just finished cleaning the large meeting room for the marketing department, Derek walked in, glanced around, and slowly shook his head, his eyes showing clear disappointment. "Janet, I really don't understand why you always do such sloppy work." Mary looked around the perfectly cleaned room, having meticulously wiped every surface, and responded in a calm voice, "I've followed the company's standards, Mr. Phillips." Derek smirked coldly, walked over to the meeting table, and deliberately knocked a few chairs that Mary had neatly arranged, causing several stacks of paper to fall to the floor. "You call this standard?" he mocked. "Really disappointing, Janet. Do it all again." Mary quietly bent down to pick up the papers, rearrange the chairs, trying her best not to show the frustration rising inside her. But Derek didn't stop there. After she finished for the second time, Derek returned, holding a full cup of coffee. He stood at a distance, watching her with a nonchalant, mocking expression, then suddenly walked over and placed the coffee cup heavily on the table, causing the coffee to spill all over the freshly cleaned surface. "Oh, sorry, Janet," Derek said with sarcastic sweetness. "I've bothered you again. Clean this spot properly now, and this time be more careful." Mary silently wiped the table again, her movements careful, hiding the anger and humiliation building up within her. But Derek was still unsatisfied. After she placed the rag down, he walked around the room, swiping his hand along a decorative picture frame, then nonchalantly looked at Mary, his voice colder than before. "You know, Janet, they say old age brings wisdom, but it seems that doesn't apply to you, does it? This is what you call clean. You think the company pays you to do this half-heartedly?" Mary bit back the hurt, and she continued to wipe again. But every time Derek spoke, every unreasonable demand he made, Mary's stress grew. Derek was clearly pushing her, wearing down her patience and endurance. Not only that, Derek frequently demanded Mary clean his private office while he continued to work late. Mary couldn't ignore the fact that Derek wanted her to endure psychological stress, constantly being watched so closely. There were times when he just sat silently, his eyes fixed on her every movement, without saying a word. The atmosphere in the room became suffocating, and Mary understood that Derek was deliberately creating invisible pressure, making her a prey trapped in his cruel psychological game. These actions went on continuously, day after day, causing Mary to feel tense and anxious every time she had to face Derek. She never imagined that she, once the head of the entire corporation, would one day feel fear just from seeing an underling of her own company. But it was Derek's indifference and coldness that gradually pushed Mary into a state of extreme tension. What hurt Mary even more was witnessing the indifferent attitude of other young managers who did nothing in response to Derek's outrageous behavior. They stood by, seeing the injustice, but no one dared to speak up to defend her, as they too were engulfed in fear and the culture of oppression. It was this indifferent attitude that made Mary realize that Derek wasn't the only one. He was just a representative of the decay and coldness that had deeply rooted itself in the core of the company. Mary realized that Derek was using his power as a weapon, creating fear and subjugation in those weaker than him. His actions were not just personal indifference. They were a symbol of a work environment that was increasingly losing compassion and understanding. However, the more she faced this cruelty and apathy, the more Mary understood her mission. She couldn't let people like Derek continue to exist without being exposed. Her suffering, though painful and filled with tension, was an essential part of protecting the soul of Williams Innovations, once and for all. After enduring the relentless cruelty of Gerald and Derek for several days, Mary began to realize that the tension was gradually surpassing her limits. She understood that in order to assess the severity of the issue, she needed to find out whether the company's internal system was still strong enough to protect its employees. With this thought in mind, Mary made a bold decision to meet with Karen Mitchell, the Human Resources Director of Williams Innovations, who was directly responsible for safeguarding the rights and safety of the staff. Karen Mitchell was a well-known figure in the human resources field. With nearly 20 years of experience, she was famous for her strict leadership style, always placing the company's interests above all else. However, Mary remembered that in the past, Karen had been a manager who was dedicated and genuinely concerned about every employee, no matter their position. For that reason, Mary had high hopes for this meeting, although she still felt a bit hesitant thinking about the possibility of disappointment. That afternoon, Mary gathered her courage and walked into the Human Resources office on the 20th floor. The office was tastefully arranged, cozy, with lush green plants, and framed pictures of outstanding employees hanging neatly on the walls as proof of an ideal work environment. But Mary knew that the truth was sometimes far from the polished exterior. Karen Mitchell sat behind a large desk, her blonde hair neatly tied up, her sharp features and stern glasses giving her a professional and reliable appearance. At first glance, Karen radiated professionalism and trustworthiness, but the coldness in her eyes seemed to have lost the warmth Mary once knew. Upon seeing Mary enter, Karen merely glanced up briefly before turning back to her computer screen, as if Mary didn't exist. "What do you need?" Karen spoke in a calm voice, but there was a distinct coldness. Mary gently replied, "I'm here to report some serious issues that I and several other janitorial staff have been enduring recently." Karen paused, looking up at Mary more intently, her expression a mixture of surprise and slight annoyance. "You're Janet, the night shift janitor, right?" Karen asked, purposely emphasizing the words janitor as a reminder of Mary's position. Mary nodded calmly. "Yes, I'm Janet. I would like to report the mistreatment and humiliation that I and my colleagues have been subjected to by some of the senior management." Karen silently observed Mary for a few seconds, then crossed her arms, sighed, and said, "All right, Janet, keep it brief. I have many important things to do." Mary felt a bit deflated by this attitude, but still maintained a polite tone. "Specifically, Gerald Hayes and Derek Phillips. They continuously make unreasonable demands, forcing us to redo tasks over and over again, deliberately creating situations to publicly humiliate us in front of others." Karen raised an eyebrow, her gaze cold and skeptical. "Are you sure you're not overreacting, Janet? In the workplace, sometimes leaders have to be strict to ensure work quality. This isn't anything new." Mary stayed calm and explained further, "I understand that, but their actions go beyond what is acceptable. Gerald publicly poured cold water on my head, and Derek intentionally made a mess to make me redo tasks multiple times. That's not strictness. That's bullying and degrading our dignity." Karen sighed, glanced at her watch, and shrugged casually. "I understand how you feel, Janet, but you need to look at things realistically. This is a competitive business environment, and sometimes small hurts are inevitable. If you're feeling upset, I suggest you adapt instead of being overly sensitive to situations like this." Mary stood silent, struck by Karen's cold and irresponsible response. She tried once more, hoping for a slim chance. "Doesn't the HR department have any policies in place to protect low-level employees like us?" Karen frowned in irritation, her voice growing colder. "We are, of course, always ready to protect employees, but you need to understand your position and role. If everyone came here to complain about small issues, this company would never grow. You're a janitor. Your job is to do your tasks well, not to come up here and complain about the harshness of the work." Mary stood motionless, her heart aching at Karen's dismissive and indifferent attitude. She realized that the person she had once hoped would be her final support had completely changed. Karen was no longer the passionate and fair HR manager she once knew, but had become a part of the heartless machinery, indifferent to the injustice occurring right before her eyes. Karen emphasized once more, her voice cold and blunt, "Janet, remember that this company hired you to clean, not to evaluate or comment on the management's leadership methods. I hope you won't waste any more of our time." Mary tried to remain composed, bowed her head, and left the office. In that moment, she understood how deeply rotten the company culture had become. This crushing disappointment didn't just come from Gerald or Derek's attitudes, but also from the Human Resources Department, which should have been the last refuge for the most vulnerable employees. Mary silently walked toward the elevator, her heart heavy with the bitter feeling of betrayal. But she also understood that Karen's coldness had only clarified her mission. She couldn't just rely on the internal system to change the situation. Mary knew that to restore the true values of Williams Innovations, she would have to expose people like Karen, Gerald, and Derek, those quietly destroying the very foundation she had worked so hard to build. Mary walked out of the Human Resources office, her heart heavy with disappointment. The small hopes she had placed in Karen Mitchell and the department that was supposed to protect employees' rights had shattered completely. Now, Mary understood that she was utterly alone in the fight to defend the values and soul of the company she had once devoted her life to building. A few days had passed since the crushing disappointment with Karen, and Mary continued her work quietly, but the feeling of loneliness and exhaustion was becoming more and more evident on her face. Each night, as she walked into the company under the dim light of the hallway, Mary no longer felt at home here as she once did. Instead, it felt like stepping into a hostile territory, where every gaze was filled with contempt and indifference. One evening, Mary was tasked with cleaning the large conference room on the 44th floor, where the senior leadership often held their end-of-day meetings. The room was spacious and luxurious, with exquisite wood furnishings and high-end leather chairs. Mary always took care to follow the established cleaning procedures because she knew that no matter how well she did her job, even the smallest mistake could be used as an excuse for the senior managers to humiliate her again. That night, as Mary was carefully cleaning the conference table, the door to the room suddenly swung open. Veronica Wells, the vice president of business, entered with a group of lower-level employees carrying documents. Veronica, in her 40s, was dressed in formal attire, her commanding presence evident in her every gesture and sharp, authoritative gaze. As she entered, Veronica scanned the room, her face showing clear signs of displeasure upon seeing Mary still in the room. "Janet, why are you still here at this hour?" Veronica's voice was cold, full of reproach. Mary quickly responded politely, "Sorry, Mrs. Wells, I'm just following the pre-scheduled cleaning routine. I'll be done in just a few minutes." But Veronica did not accept Mary's explanation. Her gaze grew more intense. "What do you think you're doing, bothering us while we're preparing for such an important meeting? Who gave you permission to interfere with the leadership's work?" Mary tried to explain again, her voice remaining calm and respectful. "I truly apologize if there's any inconvenience, but this is the procedure set by the operations department. I'm just doing my job." Veronica cut her off, her eyes blazing with anger. "Are you daring to argue with me, Janet? Have you forgotten your place?" The room fell silent, the tension almost suffocating. The employees with Veronica all lowered their heads, none of them daring to intervene. Mary stood there, trying to maintain her composure, but she could never have anticipated what would happen next, something far beyond what she could imagine. Veronica quickly walked toward her, the sound of her high heels sharply echoing against the floor. Without hesitation, Veronica raised her hand and slapped Mary across the face. The sudden force of the slap made Mary stagger backward, her cleaning tools falling to the floor with a loud clatter. The burning pain spread across her cheek, but what hurt more than the physical pain was the crushing sense of humiliation as she realized that all eyes in the room were on her. Veronica looked at Mary with deep disdain, her voice cold and ruthless. "You need to remember who you are and what position you hold in this company. If you ever dare to defy me again, I'll make sure you regret it." No one in the room spoke or reacted. The employees behind Veronica remained silent, avoiding looking at Mary as though she were an invisible object not worth their attention. Mary felt the tears welling up, but she struggled to swallow the shame and pain deep within her. In that haunting moment of silence, Mary suddenly realized a bitter truth. The company she had built with all her faith in kindness and respect had now become a place where people like Veronica could openly abuse their power and trample on the dignity of others without fear of consequence. The pain from Veronica's slap served as a harsh reminder to Mary of the complete corruption that her once proud company was now facing. But in that very moment, something important shifted within her. That humiliating slap not only made her realize the severity of the situation, but also awakened a strong determination within Mary that she could no longer remain silent. As Veronica and the others left the conference room, Mary stood up, gently wiping the tears that had fallen down her cheeks. The pain on her face was still raw, but inside, her resolve burned brighter than ever before. Mary knew that the time to act decisively had come. She could no longer allow herself or anyone else to endure this cruel injustice for even one more day. Looking around the now empty conference room, Mary whispered to herself that she would not let her sacrifice and suffering be in vain. The moment of pain and humiliation she had just experienced was not only the final limit she could accept, it was the starting point for a fierce, resolute battle to protect the soul of Williams Innovations and, more importantly, to defend the right to live and work with dignity for all those who were being overlooked and trampled on every day in this company. After the painful and humiliating slap from Veronica, Mary returned home with a stronger determination than ever before. That bitter moment not only awakened her, but also marked an important turning point. She realized it was time to take decisive action, not only to protect her own dignity, but also to save the very soul of the company she had poured her heart into building. Mary realized that relying only on words or complaints would not bring about any change. She needed clear, solid evidence. With that in mind, Mary decided to use recording devices and small cameras, secretly attached to her cleaning trolley and her uniform, to gather the most concrete evidence of the misconduct by the senior leadership team. In the following nights, Mary continued to play the role of Janet flawlessly, quietly observing and silently recording every suspicious word and action. Her carefulness and subtlety allowed her to quickly uncover a truth far more terrifying than she had imagined. One late night, while Mary was cleaning the executive office, she accidentally overheard a tense, whispered conversation coming from the small meeting room at the end of the 42nd floor corridor. Curious, Mary quietly approached, her recording device ready to capture every word. Inside the room, Mary immediately recognized familiar voices: Gerald Hayes, Derek Phillips, Veronica Wells, and Karen Mitchell were all present. Her heart pounded as she realized that the four most powerful people she had once faced were now secretly meeting together. She stood quietly by the door, the voices growing clearer from within. "We no longer have time to hesitate." Gerald's voice was the first to sound, cold and decisive. "Robert is starting to suspect. If we don't act soon, the whole plan will fall apart." Veronica spoke up confidently. "Robert is too weak to lead this company. We need a stronger leader, someone who can take the company in the right direction, the direction that benefits us," Karen added, her voice filled with calculation. "I've prepared all the internal documents and financial information. Just a few more steps, and all the evidence will show that Robert is not capable of leading. At that point, the board will have no choice but to fire him." Derek interjected with disdain. "Let's finish this plan quickly. We need to move more budget into the subsidiary companies we control before everything gets exposed." Mary stood outside the door, her heart freezing with each word she heard. She couldn't believe that these four key figures in the company she and Robert had trusted so much were now plotting betrayal. Not only were they bullying and oppressing lower-level employees, but they were also preparing a plan to overthrow Robert, her beloved and trusted successor. The conversation continued, and Mary began to understand the full scope of the conspiracy. Gerald kept emphasizing, "When Robert steps down, I'll take over as CEO. The senior positions will go to you. At that point, we will have full control over Williams Innovations, and no one will be able to stop us." Derek's cold laugh echoed, filled with satisfaction. "Then we'll easily partner with competitors to rake in more profits. Remember, money is what matters most. not the flowery ideals about ethics that Mary and Robert have always preached. At this point, Mary felt a deep pain and anger rising within her, but she knew she could not let her emotions cloud her judgment. She moved carefully, maintaining absolute silence, ensuring the recording devices and cameras continued to capture every word and action inside the room. The conversation ended, and the group inside left the room one by one, completely unaware that everything they had just discussed had been secretly recorded by Mary. Once they were gone, Mary slowly stood up, her steps slightly shaky from what she had just heard, but her resolve also growing stronger. Returning home in a state of both shock and determination, Mary carefully reviewed all the evidence she had collected. The video clips, the clear audio recordings of Gerald, Derek, Veronica, and Karen's dark and ambitious conspiracy played out before her. These were no longer just indifferent, ruthless managers. They had become dangerous traitors, ready to destroy the company from the inside to satisfy their own insatiable greed. Mary sat silently in the small room, her mind spinning with thoughts. This was no longer just a personal matter or her own pain. This was the future and destiny of the entire company, of the honest workers who labored day and night at Williams Innovations. She knew she could no longer hesitate for even a moment. The secret plan, the recording devices, the sacrifices made along the way, all of these had led her to one final choice: to take decisive action to protect her son, to protect the company she had once cherished, and to defend the innocent employees who were being trampled every day. In that moment of decision, Mary knew the battle ahead would be brutal and full of risks, but she also understood there was no other way. With the evidence in hand, she was determined to rise up, ready to expose all the dark truths about Gerald, Derek, Veronica, and Karen, those she had once considered colleagues, but who had now become the most dangerous enemies, quietly sabotaging everything she loved and held dear. After what she discovered in the private meeting room, Mary realized there was no time to hesitate any longer. She couldn't handle everything on her own. She needed to speak directly with Robert, the only person she trusted now, and the one who was becoming the main target in the insidious plot of the traitors right beside him. Mary had never imagined that one day she would have to face her own son in such a difficult situation. Throughout her secret journey, she had tried to keep her identity hidden so she could observe the situation as truthfully as possible. But the current circumstances no longer allowed her to keep the secret any longer. Mary decided to meet with Robert privately to reveal all the truth she had worked hard to uncover over the past few days. The meeting took place on a late afternoon in Robert's quiet apartment in the city center. When Robert opened the door and saw Mary standing there, a brief moment of confusion flashed across his face, but it quickly turned into joy and surprise. "Mom! What are you doing here without warning?" Mary stepped in, embraced her son tightly, feeling a rare sense of peace she hadn't experienced in a long time. Robert immediately sensed something unusual in his mother's expression, and his eyes grew more concerned. "What's going on, Mom? Why do you seem so tense?" Mary gently sat down on the sofa, trying to calm herself, then looked directly into Robert's eyes, her voice serious and full of emotion. "Robert, I'm here today because there's something extremely important I need to tell you. Please listen carefully to what I'm about to say." Robert nodded, a vague sense of unease rising in him as he noticed how serious his mother was. Mary took a deep breath, then slowly revealed the truth she had kept hidden all this time. "Recently, I secretly returned to Williams Innovations under the guise of a janitor named Janet." Robert was stunned, unable to believe what he had just heard. His face showed shock. "What did you say? What did you do? Why would you do that?" Mary continued calmly, gently explaining further. I've heard a lot of bad rumors about the company culture and the management policies lately. I didn't want to believe them, but I needed to verify it myself. So, I disguised myself to observe the situation from the inside. Robert sat in stunned silence, unable to hide his astonishment that his mother had gone to such extremes. Mary looked deeply into Robert's eyes, then gently placed her hand on his shoulder, her voice growing stronger. "But what I discovered, Robert, is far worse than I ever imagined. It's not. Just the disregard for lower-level employees, the indifference, and the cruelty, but I also uncovered a very serious betrayal plot." Robert frowned, his face filled with confusion and concern. "A betrayal plot? What do you mean?" Mary slowly took a small USB drive from her pocket and placed it on the table in front of Robert. "I've gathered all the evidence, including audio recordings and videos, clearly proving that Gerald Hayes, Derek Phillips, Veronica Wells, and even Karen Mitchell, people whom you and I trusted wholeheartedly, are planning to force you to resign as CEO and then take full control of the company." Robert was shocked, his face turning pale. He sat still for a few seconds, his eyes fixed on the USB in front of him. The people he had once considered close allies, the ones he met and trusted every day, were actually the ones preparing to stab him in the back with a fatal blow. Robert picked up the USB, his gaze shifting from doubt to deep pain. "Are you sure about this? Could it be a misunderstanding?" Mary took Robert's hand gently but firmly. "I wish this were just a misunderstanding, son, but the evidence I have is very clear. I've heard them discussing and planning everything myself. I didn't want to believe it, but it's the truth I can't deny." Robert lowered his head, his eyes showing the deep sorrow of realizing he had trusted the wrong people. "I can't believe it. The people I placed all my trust in betraying me so coldly like this." Mary tightened her grip on Robert's hand, looking deeply into his eyes, and softly said with determination, "We can't just sit here and suffer, Robert. We need to stand strong and take action. Not just to protect your interests, but to protect this company, to protect all the innocent employees who work day and night at Williams Innovations." Robert raised his head, his eyes gradually becoming more resolute, the shock and pain giving way to a strong determination. "You're right. We can't let them keep acting like this. We have to bring everything to light." Mary smiled softly, relieved to see her son regain his composure and determination to act. She knew the upcoming battle would be incredibly difficult and tense, but now she was no longer alone. She and Robert would stand together to expose all the dark and malicious truths. In the eyes of the mother and son at that moment, there was no longer any doubt or pain from betrayal, only a strong resolve to fight for what was right, to reclaim the soul and true values of Williams Innovations from those ready to destroy it all for their own insatiable greed. After the tense but crucial conversation with Robert, Mary knew that she and her son no longer had much time to hesitate. It was time for them to act quickly. Mary understood that in order to fully expose the true faces of Gerald, Derek, Veronica, and Karen before the board of directors, they needed a thorough, clear, and certain plan. Even the smallest mistake could cause all their efforts to be in vain. The very next morning, Robert immediately called an emergency board meeting, citing the need to discuss serious issues that could directly impact the future of the company. The announcement of the unexpected meeting caused a stir throughout the company. Gerald, Derek, Veronica, and Karen were also uneasy, though they tried to maintain their calm and confidence as usual. Meanwhile, Mary and Robert quietly prepared every detail for the upcoming meeting. Mary decided that she would appear one last time as Janet, keeping her true identity a secret until the very last moment. She knew that only when everyone was convinced she was just a lowly janitor would the revelation have the greatest impact, leaving everyone shocked and unable to deny the clear evidence that she and Robert had gathered. The evening before the meeting, Mary once again donned her familiar gray janitor's uniform, carefully adjusting her silver hair and thick glasses to completely conceal her true identity. She stood before the mirror for a long time, looking at Janet's reflection, feeling both bitter and proud of what she had done over the years. Mary told herself that this would be the last time she would endure such a lowly position, and she would use it to seek justice for all the invisible workers she had witnessed suffering oppression and disrespect every day. Meanwhile, Robert secretly prepared detailed documents, including audio recordings and video evidence provided by Mary, along with financial records they had gathered, clearly showing the malicious plot of the 4 senior managers. Robert had even prepared a carefully thought-out presentation, ensuring he could convince the board of directors as convincingly as possible when the time came to reveal the truth. On the morning of the meeting, the atmosphere in Williams Innovations' office building grew unusually tense and heavy. Board members arrived earlier than usual, each curious about the real reason CEO Robert had called an emergency meeting. Gerald, Derek, Veronica, and Karen also arrived promptly, outwardly calm, but their eyes could not hide the underlying anxiety as they exchanged worried glances. While the senior members gathered in the large conference room on the 45th floor, Mary continued with her role, silently cleaning the hallway right outside the meeting room door, maintaining a calm expression and discreetly observing the events around her. A few employees walked by and noticed her, but paid no attention, treating her as an invisible part of the office, just as she had painfully experienced before. Just before the meeting began, Robert stepped out of his office, his eyes briefly meeting Mary's as she was cleaning the hallway. In that fleeting moment, mother and son exchanged a meaningful and determined look. Robert took a deep breath and walked into the meeting room with a strong and resolute attitude, ready to face the life-or-death battle to protect the company's future and his own honor. Inside the conference room, all board members were present. Gerald, Veronica, Derek, and Karen sat near each other, trying to appear calm, but their eyes betrayed the doubt and tension they felt when they saw Robert's unusually serious demeanor. Robert stood up and began with a deep, clear voice. "I called this meeting today because I have discovered some extremely serious issues within the company. These issues not only threaten the future of the company, but also jeopardize the stability and reputation we have built over the years." Gerald quickly interjected, trying to downplay the tension. "I don't quite understand, Robert. We're all here, and we don't see any major issues like you say." Robert coldly locked eyes with Gerald, his voice sharp. "Perhaps it's because you and some others here are the ones who created that problem, Gerald." Robert's words immediately chilled the atmosphere in the room. Gerald turned pale. Derek and Veronica exchanged looks of panic, while Karen struggled to maintain an impassive expression, though the tension was clear on her face. Robert continued, each word clear as a sentence of condemnation. "I hold undeniable evidence that you all conspired together to overthrow me from the CEO position, embezzle funds, and even secretly leak confidential information to our competitors." Gerald jumped up, trying to strongly deny the accusation. "Robert, you can't just accuse us like this. This is a serious insult." Robert calmly responded, "I will not make any accusations without clear evidence, and I believe what you are about to see will make everyone understand the truth." While the tension in the conference room reached its peak, outside, Mary silently waited. She knew that the moment for her to step forward and reveal the truth was very near. Taking a deep breath, Mary steeled herself for the most powerful and decisive revelation of her life, the moment she believed would completely turn the tide, exposing all the truth to the light and permanently ending the tyranny and lies of the betrayers in the company she had once wholeheartedly built. As the tension in the boardroom became as tight as a string after Robert's cold accusations, Gerald suddenly stood up, his eyes filled with anger and dissatisfaction. He shot a challenging glance at Robert, then jerked his head toward Mary, still dressed in the janitor's uniform, standing quietly outside the boardroom door. "You're letting these lowly people linger around during something as important as this, Robert?" Gerald's voice dripped with contempt as his venomous gaze locked onto Mary. Since when did a board meeting include a frail, useless janitor like her? A few murmurs began, and the board members' eyes started turning toward Mary, whom they had long ignored. In that moment, the room seemed to freeze in awkwardness and tension, but Mary remained standing, her face remarkably calm, showing no signs of distress despite Gerald's biting words. Gerald stepped closer, continuing to mock her in a crude, loud voice. "Janet, didn't I make myself clear? Your place is in the restroom, or some filthy corner where cleaning needs to be done, not here eavesdropping on executive meetings. Do you understand your lowly position, or has old age made you senile?" Mary remained silent, her gaze unwavering as she locked eyes with Gerald with absolute calmness. Robert watched his mother from behind the conference table, his anxiety mounting, but he knew this was the moment his mother had been waiting for. Unable to tolerate Mary's indifference, Gerald grew even angrier. He turned to Robert, his voice becoming sharper. "Robert, you can't let someone this useless cause chaos at an important meeting. Order her to leave right now." Robert stared at Gerald, his voice cold and full of hidden meaning. "I think you should be careful with your words, Gerald. There are things you'll regret if you don't stop right now." Gerald frowned, confused, while the others in the room began to sense that something strange was unfolding. The atmosphere grew more mysterious and tense. It was then that Mary took a step forward, drawing everyone's gaze to her. Slowly and purposefully, she began to remove her thick glasses and the silver wig that had concealed her true face all this time. The room fell into complete silence as everyone stared in shock at the elderly janitor's unusual actions. And when Mary Williams's true face, the woman who was once a legend, the revered founder of Williams Innovations, was revealed, astonishment spread quickly across the room. Whispers filled the air, and many stood up, unable to believe their eyes. Gerald stood frozen, his face pale with fear, as he realized that the person he had just humiliated was none other than Mary Williams. "Hello, everyone," Mary spoke, her voice loud and authoritative, just like in the past. "Perhaps some of you in this room have forgotten who I am. I am Mary Williams, the founder of this company, and I stand here today not to listen to baseless insults from those who have betrayed the trust I once placed in them." Gerald stammered, trying to say something, but his words were choked in his throat, his face shifting from panic to despair. Veronica, Derek, and Karen also turned pale, panicked by the unbelievable truth unfolding before their eyes. Before anyone could react, Mary walked up to the conference table, took out a small USB drive, and plugged it into the central computer. Immediately, the large screen in front of the board members lit up, displaying clear, detailed videos and audio recordings that Mary had gathered. All the evidence was irrefutable. Gerald, Derek, Veronica, and Karen's true faces were exposed through their words and actions, conspiring to force Robert to resign, embezzle funds, and leak confidential information. The boardroom fell into complete silence as everyone struggled to comprehend what they were witnessing. The board members' eyes gradually shifted from shock to fury and deep disappointment as they understood the gravity of the actions these 4 senior managers had taken. Gerald slumped into his chair, his face now showing sheer despair, as everything he had built through greed and manipulation was laid bare for all to see. Veronica and Karen frantically tried to explain themselves, but their weak words quickly drowned out by the cold, angry stares of the board. Derek could only remain silent, his usual arrogance gone. Robert stood up, his voice firm and resolute. "This is why I called this meeting today, not just for betrayal, but for the severe violations of the business ethics that Williams Innovations has always committed to. I propose that the board immediately suspend these 4 individuals and launch a full internal investigation." The board members unanimously nodded in agreement with Robert's words. The room was filled with anger, but also with a sense of relief as the truth was finally revealed. Mary stood silently beside Robert, her gaze no longer filled with pain or fear, but with pride and deep determination. This dramatic revelation wasn't just a sweet revenge for the suffering she had endured, but also the first step in reclaiming the soul and true values of Williams Innovations. Before the stunned eyes of the traitors and the respectful gaze of the board members, Mary smiled lightly, a smile of relief. Finally, justice had spoken, and she knew that the company she had once loved so deeply would be restored to what she had built with her entire life. After the dramatic revelation that left everyone in shock, the meeting room was enveloped in a heavy silence. Gerald, Veronica, Derek, and Karen sat motionless, their faces dazed, no trace of arrogance remaining. Everyone else looked at them with expressions of disappointment, anger, and estrangement. An instant in which the once powerful 4 now had to face the consequences of the wrongdoings they had concealed for far too long. Robert slowly stood up, his gaze serious as it swept across the faces of the betrayers. His voice rang out, full of weight and resolve. "What we have just witnessed is not only a betrayal of personal trust, but also a severe insult to the core values that have made Williams Innovation successful. Therefore, right here, in front of the board of directors, I officially announce the immediate termination of Gerald Hayes, Derek Phillips, Veronica Wells, and Karen Mitchell." Gerald immediately stood up, attempting to regain his usual authority to defend himself. "Robert, you can't do this. I've dedicated so many years to this company, you can't—" But Robert cut him off sharply, without hesitation or mercy. "Because you've spent so many years in this company, Gerald. Your betrayal and unethical actions are even more unforgivable. Loyalty is never an excuse to cover up abuse of power and betrayal of trust." Gerald slumped back into his chair, his face pale, completely powerless in the face of Robert's strong and definitive words. Derek, Veronica, and Karen exchanged confused glances, but none of them dared to speak again. The door to the meeting room opened, and 2 security personnel entered, standing at attention, awaiting orders. Robert gave a small nod, his voice still firm and clear. "Please escort these 4 out of the company immediately. Revoke all system and company device access they hold. Any documents and evidence related will be handed over to the authorities for further investigation." No one objected. All the board members agreed with this decision. Gerald and the others stood up heavily and walked out of the room, under the cold and contemptuous gaze of the entire board. Veronica lowered her head, her steps trembling. Derek and Karen, who had always appeared cold and indifferent, were now completely silent, their faces devoid of any arrogance. The door slammed shut behind them, marking the end of a dark chapter in the history of Williams Innovations. In the meeting room, only deep silence remained. Mary slowly stood up and walked over to Robert. Her eyes swept the room, and she could clearly feel the renewed trust and respect on the faces of each board member. Mary's voice was calm but incredibly powerful. Today is not just the day we remove betrayers, but also the day we begin a new chapter. A chapter where Williams Innovations returns to the values I once built: respect, fairness, and dignity for all, no matter their position or role in the company. Robert nodded in agreement, continuing his mother's words with confidence and clear determination in each of his statements. From this day forward, our company will undergo a comprehensive cultural, managerial, and internal process overhaul. We will establish a transparent system where employees at all levels can raise issues they face without fear of retaliation or oppression from superiors. The board members unanimously clapped, their faces displaying enthusiasm and determination. The initial tension in the room was gradually replaced with relief and hope. Mary continued, her voice becoming warmer as she looked at Robert. I know my son, Robert, is the one most deserving of leading this company into a new chapter. I have full faith in his abilities, and I trust in the potential for change and growth in everyone sitting in this room. Robert turned to Mary, his eyes filled with gratitude and pride. He spoke sincerely. And I also want to thank you, Mom, for sacrificing your honor and enduring humiliation to bring the truth to light. Your courageous and responsible actions are the most valuable lesson for all of us. Once again, the meeting room echoed with applause, as everyone deeply felt the respect for Mary and Robert, who had bravely stood up against injustice and lies, safeguarding the true values of the company. The meeting ended with a completely different atmosphere, one filled with trust and optimism for the future. As the board members left the room, each felt a sense of relief, knowing that justice had finally been served, and the moral values and fairness the company had once committed to would be restored stronger than ever. Only Mary and Robert remained in the now quiet room, standing together, looking out the large window as the gentle sunlight streamed through the layers of clouds. Mary smiled and softly said, "Everything has finally ended, Robert. But I believe this is also a promising new beginning for the company we hold dear." Robert nodded gently, gripping his mother's hand, his eyes filled with determination. "Yes, Mom, and I promise you that from now on, Williams Innovations will always be a place where all employees are respected and treated fairly, just as you taught me." They stood in silence, feeling a sense of peace, pride, and trust, knowing that, although the battle had been difficult and intense, from this moment forward, Williams Innovations was ready to step into a new, bright, and hopeful chapter. The following days saw a powerful transformation at Williams Innovations. With the experienced and attentive guidance of Mary, coupled with Robert's determination to innovate, the company underwent a comprehensive overhaul, not just in governance structure but also in leadership mindset, behavior culture, and human management practices. After completely eliminating the toxic and traitorous elements, the atmosphere within the company gradually shifted from one of suffocation and fear to confidence, trust, and openness. With her experience and sharp insight, Mary didn't return directly to an executive role, but played an especially important role as a spiritual and strategic advisor to Robert. She guided her son step by step in rebuilding the fundamental values the company had lost: respect, fairness, and responsibility. Mary knew that true rebirth wasn't just about firing the wrong people. It was about deeply rebuilding the system of beliefs from the ground up, putting people and humanity at the center. After the painful experience, Robert underwent profound changes. No longer the young CEO focused solely on business results, he became a more understanding and empathetic leader, frequently taking time to talk with employees at all levels. Robert learned from his mother that true leadership power didn't lie in authority, but in the ability to listen, share, and understand those around him. One of the most significant reforms that Robert and Mary pushed together was the establishment of a completely transparent internal system. Employees, regardless of their rank, were given the right to voice their opinions, provide feedback, and address issues they encountered without fear of retaliation or oppression. This new policy sparked a wave of positive change, as employees gradually regained trust in the leadership and began to actively contribute to the collective development. Regular meetings and training sessions were held to reaffirm and emphasize the company's new core values, respect and equality. In those meetings, Mary always appeared as a respected and revered advisor. The stories she told about her time posing as Janet, the suffering she endured just to uncover the truth, always deeply moved and made the entire company reflect. Mary's courageous actions were seen not only as a valuable lesson but also as a symbol of the unyielding spirit of the fight for justice, equality, and compassion in the workplace. More and more, Mary found happiness and pride in watching Robert grow stronger and more mature with each passing day and every challenge. She understood that the bitter lesson she had paid for with her dignity and pain had ultimately brought profound value not only to her son, but also to the hundreds and thousands of employees in the company she had built. Robert was no longer just a CEO running the business. He had become a true leader, one who always listened, protected employees, and was ready to fight for the noble values his mother had nurtured. Within a year of the overhaul, clear signs of positive change emerged. Employee satisfaction and trust soared, work performance significantly improved, and most importantly, stories of respectful and humane interactions between leadership and employees became increasingly common in the company. Williams Innovations was now not only a powerful financial and technological giant, but also a model of an ideal work environment where human values were placed at the forefront. For Mary, the arduous and challenging journey was not just a personal battle, but a fight for values far greater than herself. She understood that what she did was not for revenge, but to protect the weak, to fight for justice and human dignity. From Mary's story, every employee in the company, from senior management to new hires, understood that everyone deserved respect and fair treatment, regardless of their position or title. On the anniversary of the historic overhaul, during the company's intimate internal celebration, Robert stood up, moved, to speak before all the employees, his gaze full of gratitude towards his mother. A year ago, we went through an upheaval that no one could have imagined. But thanks to my mother's courage and sacrifice, Mary Williams, we overcame it together and found ourselves again. Today, I want to express my deepest thanks to my mother, who is not only my mother but also a symbol of courage, resilience, and the spirit of the fight for justice, equality, and compassion. The entire room erupted in a long, continuous round of applause. All eyes turned to Mary with deep respect and admiration. Mary stood up, looked around at all the familiar faces, and felt the happiness spread within her. She spoke softly. Life sometimes pushes us into the most challenging situations, but it is precisely in those moments that we truly understand the true value of compassion and fairness. I hope that this lesson will live on in each of us. Her sincere and profound words were met with warm applause, clearly showing the unity and determination of all the employees in the company. Williams Innovations was now not just a powerful enterprise, but also a symbol of the remarkable revival of human spirit and respect for people. Looking back at everything that had happened, Mary knew that the difficult journey had been entirely worth it. She concluded her journey not just as a mother, but as an eternal symbol, a symbol of the fight for justice, equality, and human compassion in this complex and challenging world. And that was the most meaningful and proudest achievement she had ever attained in her life. The story of Mary Williams is not just a journey of fighting against injustices in the workplace, but also a profound lesson about courage, justice, and the value of equality. Through this story, we understand that respect and humanity are the strongest foundations for building a long-lasting and sustainable business. If you were Mary Williams, what would you do if you discovered such injustices at your own company? Please share your thoughts in the comments so we can discuss together. Don't forget to like, share this video, and subscribe to the channel to follow more meaningful stories. Thank you for joining us today.